This morning's New Testament reading is from the book of Luke, chapter 16, verses 1 to 13. I'll be reading from the New International Version, and some of you may remember this as the parable of the shrewd manager. Jesus told his disciples there was a rich man whose manager was accused of wasting his possessions. So he called him in and asked him, "What is this I hear about you? Give an account of your management, because you cannot be my manager any longer." The manager said to himself, "What shall I do now? My master's taking away my job. I'm not strong enough to dig, and I'm ashamed to beg. I know what I'll do, so that when I lose my job here, people will welcome me into their houses." So he called in each one of his master's debtors. He asked the first, "How much do you owe my master?" 900 gallons of olive oil, he replied. The manager told him, "Take your bill, sit down quickly, and make it 450. Then he asked the second, "How much do you owe?" 1,000 bushels of wheat, he replied. He told him, "Take your bill and make it 800. The master commended the dishonest manager because he had acted shrewdly. For the people of this world are more shrewd in dealing with their own kind than are the people of the light. I tell you, use worldly wealth to gain friends for yourselves, so that when it is gone, you will be welcomed into eternal dwellings. Whoever can be trusted with very little can also be trusted with much, and whoever is dishonest with very little will also be dishonest with much. So if you have not been trustworthy in handling worldly wealth, who will trust you with true riches? And if you have not been trustworthy with someone else's property, who will give you property of your own? No one can serve two masters. Either you will hate one and love the other, or you will be devoted to one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and money." May the Lord bless the reading of his word.
The gospel passage that is before us this morning is one of those parables of Jesus you rarely hear people reference. Most people don't know it, and I imagine some who do might prefer they didn't. It's complex. It's confounding. It doesn't fit neatly into our tidy synopsis of the gospel story. And so often our first inclination is to simply skip it and move on. Especially in this case, here in Luke chapter 16, because right after this parable comes the parable of the lost sheep, which is certainly one of Jesus' greatest hits. And shortly after that parable comes the parable of the prodigal son. And that's in Jesus' top 5, to be sure. In fact, many people list it as number 1 in their rankings. So why mess around? Why not just skip ahead to the good stuff? And I must confess this morning that that's almost what I chose to do. This is not the sermon I wanted to preach today. Last week, we wrestled with the memory and the legacy of the 9/11 attacks, and reliving the experience of that day was taxing. I didn't know what I wanted to take on for today, but I was after something a little less weighty. Your yoke is easy and your burden is light, I found myself reminding Jesus. Let's do something straightforward this week. I buried my father 2 weeks ago. Last week, my daughters started school. This week, they're both sick. I'm tired. But instead of a greatest hit, the Revised Common Lectionary served up this deep cut of a parable, which is traditionally called the parable of the unjust steward, or in some translations, the parable of the shrewd manager. And as I stared at the page, I thought, seriously? You've got to be kidding. This is like Swiss Chalet bringing a live chicken to the table. This is not what I ordered. I don't want to deal with this, not this week. But then I thought, you know what? That sounds like the beginning of a sermon. Well played, Holy Spirit, well played. Truth be told, one of the primary approaches we take to reading the Bible is not to read sizable portions of it. We like to stick to the bits we like, the stories that are familiar, those passages that reinforce what we believe. All of us have what my seminary professors referred to as a canon within the canon. A special collection of verses and stories within the Bible that we spend our devotional time curating. We also tend to read Scripture with a bit of a Pharisaic eye, especially when we're reading within our special little collection. And I say that because we have a tendency to read with the assumption that we are right. We are the teacher's pets, dutifully sitting at the front of the class, notebooks open, pencils sharpened, hanging on every word that Jesus is speaking. And all those admonitions, all those warnings, all those woes, those are for other people. Those are for the folks slacking off in the back of the class. Which means we tend to read people with a bit of a Pharisaic eye, too. We are well acquainted with the specks in our neighbor's eyes, aren't we? Even from a distance, we regularly and confidently diagnose the sins of others, and we also tend to have a pretty good idea of what prescription they need to take to get right with God. And that's what makes this parable about the so-called unjust steward problematic. We want to condemn and criticize him. Yet, the rich man in the story, and by extension, Jesus, commends him. It'd be like, I don't know, Jesus celebrating a Samaritan. And that's why we need parables like this. There is more than enough judgment, prejudice, and self-righteousness in the world. That is not what Jesus came to inspire. In fact, he came to call us away from all that, away from pat answers and cliché proverbs, which is why I think every now and then he confounds us with parables like this one. Stories that we really have to stop and think about. Stories that require us to listen carefully and look closely and resist the temptation to move on, to skip ahead, to get to something more familiar and more comfortable. Because that's how we learn and we grow as disciples. By definition, a parable is a story that should teach us something. So let's do a little more than get our feet wet in the gospel this morning. Let's sink our hands into the mud and see what flakes of gold might emerge from the bottom of this story. Because if we just skim the surface, this story not only looks troubling, it smells toxic. At best, we see an arbitrary God at work, punishing dishonesty at one turn and then praising dishonesty at the next. At worst, we can interpret Jesus' words here as divine license for fraud. Some people say, well, it's like the story of Jacob. You know, Jacob, the patriarch, the guy who swindled his brother and his uncle, and yet is still considered to be one of the heroes of the faith. The guy, in fact, for whom the nation of Israel is named, that guy. Well, true, but there are some key differences. Jacob wanted his father's blessing, and he took advantage of his brother's appetites, literally, as well as his brother's short-sightedness. I mean, who trades their birthright for a bowl of soup? Honestly. For all we know, Jacob might have been kidding. But then he seized the moment, as it were, when Esau swallowed the bait. Plus, later in the story, when Jacob returns home, he knows he's going to have to face Esau and face up to what he did. And it's an encounter that builds with a great amount of anxiety and then resolves in this remarkable expression of grace. But that dynamic's not really at work in this parable. We are not told that the manager is seeking anything special, and unlike Esau, the rich man cares very much about what he has. Charges are brought. The rich man accuses the manager of squandering his wealth. So in fear, and perhaps even panic, the manager further squanders the rich man's wealth by calling in those who owe him money and reducing their debts. And he does that for the express purpose of sort of having them in his pocket. So they'll do him a favor later on down the road. End of story. It's pure quid pro quo here. And Jesus then says to the disciples, make friends for yourselves by means of dishonest wealth. He calls it dishonest. The other major distinction here is that in Jacob's story, Laban duped Jacob too. Jacob asked to marry Rachel and agreed to work for the right to marry her, but when the day arrived, he was given Leah's hand instead. He then had to work even longer to marry the woman he really wanted to marry. So Laban got 14 years of work out of Jacob instead of the promised 7. Jacob could argue that he raised every single one of the sheep and the goats he stole from his uncle. It was an act of poetic justice. But if the manager in Jesus' parable is dishonest, then there's no place for poetic justice here. He got caught, pure and simple. And now, because he's been caught, he's desperate, and he takes the actions of a desperate man. It's an impressive bit of quick thinking on his part, to be sure. But it hardly seems praiseworthy. Yet Jesus seems to be saying it's praiseworthy. Not only praiseworthy, but an example to be emulated. Pay attention now, kids. This is how you hustle your way into heaven. What are we to do with this? And please hear me say, I'm wrestling with this too. Contrary to what some people seem to think, I don't have a red phone in my office over there where I can just call up Jesus and say, hey, what's the scoop? I wish I did. It'd make things a lot easier. But I don't. I don't have that phone, and I don't know everything, but I do know this. We arrive at a lot of these troubling conclusions about this parable because we who are affluent, who live and work and go to church in an affluent part of an affluent city in an affluent country, read this parable assuming the rich man is honest. But there are clues sprinkled throughout Jesus' telling of this story that would question that assumption. Make friends for yourselves by means of dishonest wealth, Jesus says. But whose wealth is he talking about? It's not the manager's. He doesn't have any. If he did, he wouldn't be so concerned about his fate in the near future. What's more, Jesus does not call this manager dishonest up front. We take that idea into the story from the traditional title that is given to the parable, and it's not a title that Jesus gave to it. Other clues get lost in translation as well. Jesus uses an interesting word in the first line of this parable. The only time it appears in the entire New Testament. It's the Greek word diabolo, which means to accuse, but it carries a connotation. It carries a connotation of accusing someone with ulterior motives. Even if the accusation is true, it implies that the person bringing the charges is doing so maliciously. So someone, we don't know whom, is accusing this manager of squandering the rich man's wealth. But Jesus, by his choice of words, is casting a shade of doubt onto the validity of that accusation. And notice how the rich man responds. Is there a hearing? Is there evidence presented? Is the manager offered an opportunity to tell his side of the story? No. He's asked for an accounting, but in the same breath the rich man asks for it, he then tells him to pack his bags and hit the road. He doesn't wait to receive the accounting before he passes judgment. Maybe the manager was squandering the master's wealth. We don't really know. But whether he was or he wasn't, safeguarding the rich man's property does not appear to be the only or perhaps even the primary motive of the manager's accuser. So in this light, the manager's actions take on a different hue. I think we'd all agree there's a difference between stealing a tomato when you want to throw it at somebody and stealing a tomato because you're hungry. The manager finds himself in a situation where he has no power and no recourse. He's in a bind. He says he's too weak to dig, and he's too proud to pour. And really, who among us would choose begging as an action plan? So he decides he will alter the bills of those who owe money to the rich man and thus curry favor with them. Only at this point does Jesus say, "And the rich man commended the dishonest manager, for he acted shrewdly." And now we should be clear. The manager did something he should not have done. He had no authority or right to do what he did. He overstepped the bounds of his position, and he broke any number of laws. But there's something else about the manager's actions. He could have gone after his accuser. He could have tried to discredit or at least embarrass the rich man out of revenge, even spite. But he doesn't do any of that. Instead, he sets out on a course of action that, to the best of his ability, under the circumstances, is in essence a win-win for himself and other people who are trapped under this rich man's sway. Their debts get reduced, and he earns their good favor. He makes the best of a bad situation, not just for himself, but for others. He helps people in the same tenuous position that he is in, others trapped within the confines of this same system. Another detail that is lost in translation, at least among a lot of English translations of the Bible, are the sizable amounts of the debts that the manager adjusts. My translation says that one man owed this rich man 100 jugs of olive oil, a jug being a bath or a batos, which, for the best that we know about Jesus' time, one of those jugs was approximately 9 gallons. That's a lot of olive oil. The other man who comes before the manager owes him 100 containers or cores of wheat. We don't really know how much a core was equivalent to, but the best scholars estimate it was anywhere from 6.5 to 10 bushels. So think about that. This man owes the rich man somewhere between 650 and 1,000 bushels of wheat. Those are the kinds of debts that hold people hostage. And all of this makes the rich man's behavior toward the end of the parable all the more fascinating and unexpected too. By cutting these bills in half, he has lost a lot of money through the manager's actions. A lot. He could have gone after the manager. He could have had him prosecuted, thrown in jail. He could have ruined him. And a lot of people in Jesus' day would have thought he was justified in doing so. But he doesn't do that either. Instead, he praises the manager's actions. In the face of the system, he applauds the manager's shrewdness. So now everything should be crystal clear, right? Now that we've stirred the waters, what do we do with this cloudy mess? What do we take away from it? Well, first, I think on some level we have to allow this parable and others like it. It's certainly not the only one. We have to let this parable remain somewhat confounding to us. Whenever we arrive at a place where we feel we understand it all, we are on some spiritually dangerous ground. We start to see ourselves as larger than our own humanity. Second, we have to keep wrestling. We have to keep searching. We have to keep seeking understanding and continue to work out what it means to live as children of light in a world where such messy parables are part of our faith. In a world in which the world itself is such a very messy and complex place. How do we navigate the darkness around us? For that matter, how do we navigate the darkness within us? Thirdly, we can't allow the difficulties of the narrative to cause us to miss Jesus' main point, which he gets to at the end. He says, you, yes, you. You, yes, me. You cannot serve two masters. You cannot serve both God and wealth. And that's where we really need to wrestle with Jesus and with ourselves. Finally, we need to recognize that while the dynamics of our modern life are different from the dynamics of the life that Jesus knew, this isn't a story disconnected from our present. We live our lives within systems very much like the one portrayed in Luke chapter 16. Whether they be economic systems, judicial systems, social systems, educational systems, and so on. Systems that are likewise confounding and in many ways unjust. And they're unjust because even when they're not totally dysfunctional, they privilege some and disadvantage others. It's messy. This life, this world, is messy. And we are all down in the muck together. Which is why all of us are very much in need of grace. Some of us need grace because of what the systems of this world push us to do in order to get by. Others of us need grace because of the positions we occupy within these systems that consciously or not help perpetuate the injustices and inequalities of our time. And this is true even among God's people. It's been true for millennia. The fact that the lectionary pairs Luke 16, this parable of the unjust steward, with these few verses from Amos 8, I think is really insightful and provides a lot of good fodder for us to ponder. Because in Amos chapter 8, the prophet is challenging God's people. He is challenging them to see that even though they are God's chosen, even though they have been called out, even though they observe this holy day, the Sabbath, that underneath all of their observances, there is still this desire for the Sabbath to hurry up and get over so they can get back to making money. So they can go back to participating in and manipulating the economic systems of their world, and specifically to make money off of the poor, those who are trapped within the system without much cause for recourse, without many back doors to escape through when things get tight. That was true hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years ago in Amos' day, and it's true today. I'm still learning about Canada, but I can tell you that in America, we're awfully quick to blame people for their circumstances. Particularly, we're very quick to blame people for their poverty. And we're often hesitant, even in church, to help people until they prove themselves worthy. We want everybody to get their act cleaned up. Then we'll help them. But like this parable, the realities of the situation are much, much more complicated than that. When we were in Hyattsville, I got a chance to meet a man who became a close friend through a book club that I belonged to. He's an African American who grew up in the projects around Baltimore. And he is one of those select few people who managed to make his way out of that system. He got a college education, he married a doctor, and now he's serving on the city council in Hyattsville. And he's made a reputation for himself as a jeweler, a man who makes one-of-a-kind pieces of jewelry that he sells on the internet and apparently does a good business. But as we were sitting around the tables of this book club and talking about experience and talking about the books that we were reading, which were designed to prompt us to think more critically and more realistically about the world in which we live, Robert would share his story and talk about what it was like to grow up on welfare and to be on food stamps and all these other things. And one night, this other person around the table asked Robert, "Well, so did you cheat the system?" And he looked at this person very matter-of-factly and said, "Of course we cheated the system. It's the only way to make the system work for you. Because the system was not designed to work for us. It was designed to work for somebody campaigning in Washington. If you didn't gain the system, you didn't get by." Later on, we had a chance to watch a documentary together. That was a pattern we fell into, and we would finish a book. We'd spend the next time watching a movie or something before we transitioned to the next book. And I found this documentary that followed the lives of these four people struggling in the American economy to cast some light on what their daily lives were like. I don't remember what the movie was called, but it followed a guy who worked as a security guard in Chicago for minimum wage. It followed a single mom who was struggling with all kinds of debt that she couldn't get out from under after her husband walked out and left her and her son. And it followed this woman who had grown up. She had come through the social services system, and now she found herself as a manager for the social home that she herself had grown up in as a teenager. But the job didn't pay very much. It was a nonprofit. And so even though she had this job, she was on public assistance while she was trying to raise her son and go to school to better her life. And one of the most powerful parts of the documentary comes when after she finishes her degree and she goes out and she does what everybody hopes to do when they finish their degree, she gets a better job. A job she's excited about, a job that pays more money. But then she has to go and check in with the social services office. And she's excited to tell them, I got a job. And I can't remember what the amount was, but it was something like she's going to be making $500 more a month than she was currently making. And so her social worker put it into the system, said, that's great. By the way, now the system is fitting back to us that because you got this job, we're reducing your benefits by $600 a month. And that was her reaction too, as she realized she was going to be worse off for having tried to do better. Because that's the nature of the system in which she was living. And so after the film was over, this woman came up to me. She had been to the book club a couple times, not very consistently, but she thanked me. She said, I want to thank you for finding this movie to show us tonight. Because I'm a teacher down at the local elementary school. And when school starts, this is going to help me see the lives of a lot of the kids in my class a lot more differently. Because I can see now what they're struggling with at home. This is not the sermon I wanted to preach today. But this parable is one that as we as a church make our way into the new school year, into the rest of 2016, as we seek to make our way out into this world that God has called us to serve, this is a parable that we all need to hear and that we all need to wrestle with if we seek to live as children of light and desire to follow Jesus as people of grace, because we have to live and move and minister to people who live in that kind of complex reality. And you know what? There's actually a correlation between this parable of the unjust steward and the parable of the prodigal son that we all often run by this one to get to. And it's the word squandered. The manager in this parable is accused of squandering the rich man's wealth. Jesus tells us in the parable of the prodigal son that the younger son squandered his inheritance. He asked his dad, "Give me what's mine," and then he went off and partied and blew it. He squandered it. This son of a rich man, through foolishness and selfishness, squandered what he had been given. And yet, we often tend to have more sympathy for him. I wonder why that is. May God give us ears to hear and courage not to skip ahead, not to rush to get to those parts of the gospel story that make us feel good and make us feel comfortable, but to not be afraid to get our hands muddy in our search for truth as we seek to live as people of grace. Thanks be to God. Amen.